The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it. Russia recently celebrated Victory Day on May the 9th. It's a symbolic day for all of Russia and other former Soviet Union republics to celebrate Victory Day, which marks the end of the Second World War with the surrender of Nazi Germany and the Soviet forces taking control of Berlin. Yet this year was ironic, because months earlier it was Russia that had invaded a smaller neighbor, an erstwhile Soviet state like it was 1939. And Vladimir Putin is no stranger to history. The former KGB man has been an antagonist of the West and has seen 5 U.S. presidents during his 2-decade-plus rule. He has long been in the crosshairs of Western powers, especially during the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and now a full-blooded invasion of Ukraine, justifying it as what he calls a special military action, with Putin claiming that he is trying to denazify Ukraine. There appears to be little method in the madness of Vladimir Putin, which has sparked endless speculation. Questions like, why did he do this? What is his endgame? And does he even have a realistic view of what's actually going on the ground? To seek some answers of our own, Akshobh Giridharadas spoke with Christopher Miller, an assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Miller is an expert on all things Soviet Union and Russia, and is the author of The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, Mikhail Gorbachev and the Collapse of the USSR, and Putinomics, The Power of Money in Resurgent Russia.
Thank you so much for making time. I know it's the busiest time in the world. For your expertise and perspective, and I really appreciate this time to try and unpack the complexities of 100-year history in half an hour, which is a walk in the park, I guess, for someone like yourself. But there's shifting sands right now going on with everyday reports from different parts of Ukraine, from Kharkiv or Mariupol or Lviv or Kiev. Break down where we are right now in the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, we're now almost 3 months in to a war that the Russian government hoped would last just a couple of days, if not weeks, and that the Ukrainian government hoped, and to a certain extent, I think expected, wouldn't happen at all. So in some ways, the war has surprised both parties involved in it, and I think certainly it's surprised as well outside observers in terms of the course that it's taken. The biggest surprise of the war is the extent to which the Russian military is underperformed. And we've seen with every week that passes new evidence of underperformance, both in terms of tactics, in terms of logistics, in terms of capability of equipment across the board. I think less surprising, but still notable, is the impressive performance of the Ukrainian military in terms of the extraordinary morale, in terms of their effective tactics against the Russians, and in terms of their ability to quickly integrate the new military that they're getting. And the other aspect of the war that I think is quite important is the extent to which it's impacted the home front, both in Ukraine and in Russia. In Ukraine, the war has had an impact of uniting the populace to a really extraordinary degree. And Ukraine is a country that has a tradition of divisive politics and divided governments and political parties that strongly disagree about many things, but that's all disappeared right now, and Ukraine is united at home. In Russia, the situation is similar in some ways, different in others. The government is enforcing, to a certain extent, an image of unity. Certainly the media has been clamped down on and only really allowed to report positive news about the war. But I think if you look under the surface, you see a much less united and much not divided, but much less enthusiasm about the war than previous Russian military operations, and particularly in comparison with Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. So the question going forward, I think, is to what extent do these dynamics induce one side to change its goals? Ukraine's goal is to get Russia back to at least the February 24th line of control, and Russia's goal is to push deeper into Ukraine and induce Ukraine to offer some really substantial concessions to Russia. And right now, neither side looks poised to change their war aims.
Professor Miller, you touched on the surprise element because, in the 21st century, in a very integrated economy where data crosses border fast and planes, Putin sort of invaded like it's 1939. And, on one hand, yes, this took everyone by surprise because most people thought the fighting would be restricted to, the rest of provinces of Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk, Luhansk and Donetsk. But I suppose, were there already signs, right from in Putin's time alone, Russia-Georgia conflict of 2008, the Crimea annexation 2014, were there always signs that something of this was festering, given the rest of politics in Ukraine itself?
Well, I think I would look less at the politics of Ukraine and more at the politics of Russia. I think if you look at Russia's policies towards Ukraine since 2014, there had been a long-standing occupation of two substantial chunks of Ukrainian territory. And there had been a frequent questioning by top Russian leaders of the idea of whether Ukraine was really a sovereign country or whether it was actually, to a certain extent, part of Russia, or at least part of the Russian sphere. And, if you go back before 2014, this idea was long before present. In the 1990s, for example, the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, regularly questioned Ukraine's territorial integrity and was ignored outside of Russia when he did so. It was treated as sort of domestic politics or sort of a nationalism that was not a good thing, but sort of understandable and not taken seriously. And in hindsight, the far right nationalistic parts of the Russian polity were ignored for too long. They were treated as fringe when in fact they were mainstream. And I think the Russian attack on February 24th has forced a lot of people in the West and globally to reassess their refusal to really take seriously Russian nationalism and the rejection by many Russian, including Russian leaders, of the idea that the borders between Russia and its neighbors mean anything. It was, I think, for a long time popular to just not really take seriously when Russians would quip or joke or comment that they didn't think Ukraine was a serious country. That is ignored for a long time. And now it's clear that it can't be ignored. And in fact, that idea animates not only some Russians, but the most important Russian today, Vladimir Putin.
Right. And I think as a historian, it goes back, not just present politics, it goes way back to the identity of the Russian Empire and the identity of Kievan Rus. I mean, just reading from the snippets of Putin's speeches, it seems more emotional and less practical, where he was talking about this idea of Kiev. And of course, it's the birth of the Russian Empire, the birth of Slavic identity and Orthodox Christianity. I mean, when he said things like it's an integral part of our history, not just a neighboring country, is this a sign of some form of Kievan Rus? And if so, why not now? Why 30 years after the Soviet Union has collapsed?
I think that's right. I think we do need to look at the history to understand why this war is happening now. I think it's not a coincidence that in all of his key speeches justifying the war, Putin cited ancient Russian leaders from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great. I think it's also clear that Russian leaders like Putin are citing these sort of ancient figures, these historic figures, in part because there's a sense still among many in Russia, including in the elite, of disorientation about whether Russia today is a nation or an empire. And whether the collapse of the Soviet Union that outside of Russia seemed like a done deal was in fact a done deal, or whether it was in fact a low point in Russian history that Russian leaders wanted to recover from. They defined, some of Russia's elite defined, including Putin, as reacquiring some of the territory that was quote unquote lost in 1991. So yes, I think that historical perspective is crucial. I think there's the right way to read the history. The wrong way to read the history is to say Russia's always been a big empire, therefore it has a right to be a big empire and treat its neighbors however it wants to, which I think is how Putin has cast the history. I think the right way to read it is that Russia today is trying to define its identity, and there are different periods in history one can turn to define this identity, and the Russian leadership has turned to over the past couple of months, but really over the past couple of years, turned increasingly towards the more imperialistic versions of this history, which is why you've had Putin reciting dates of battles and treaties signed several hundred years ago and justifying the war in Ukraine today.
Right. And if you just go to Ukraine politics for a minute, because, I mean, since 1991, there was always a sense of a Russian extension. I mean, the erstwhile Soviet countries and Russia sort of having a clout over Warsaw Pact countries as well. And in just back and forth, you saw between Yanukovych and Yushchenko, and in 2005 with the Orange Revolution, and then, of course, the Maidan protests. And I think after Yanukovych's ouster, did Moscow kind of feel it was losing its grip on Ukraine? And when NATO was dangled as a carrot for Ukraine, did that, push it over the edge, given the Crimean invasion which happened sort of after? And I think, in some sense, if Ukraine were to join NATO, was that just a coup de grace for Russia to sort of jump before being pushed?
It's clear that NATO enlargement plays some roles in Russian threat perceptions. It's also, I think, clear to me that it's just one of many factors. And I guess I'm struck by this week as it's clear that Finland and Sweden are going to try to join NATO and apply shortly. The extent to which Russia's fear or dissatisfaction with potential NATO membership for Ukraine is not at all aligned with really Russian acquiescence to Finland membership, even though, of course, Finland is far closer to St. Petersburg than the Ukrainian border is, say, to Moscow. And of course, the Finns have a meaningful track record in fighting the Russians quite effectively during the 20th century. So I think it's certainly wrong to say that this can all be explained by potential NATO enlargement. And of course, the context of this is that Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO in the foreseeable future because Russia was already occupying Ukrainian territory. So I think we shouldn't over-index on the NATO point, which to a certain extent reflects real Russian fears, but to also a really substantial extent reflects Russian discourse and Russia's justification for policies that it broadcasts abroad. If you ask yourself, why was Russia more afraid of Ukrainian NATO membership, theoretical future Ukrainian NATO membership, than it is of real practical Finnish NATO membership coming in some number of months' time? The answer is not because it thought that the Ukrainian army would start marching on Russia if it had joined NATO, nor does it really make sense to think about, say, NATO equipment placements in Ukraine, because, of course, there are already NATO members far closer to Russia's big cities. Finland, as I mentioned, is far closer to St. Petersburg than anything in NATO. So there's no really sensible military justification for the level of fear that Russia had of Ukrainian NATO membership relative to the lack of evident concern about Finnish or Swedish NATO membership. I think what really is relevant is that if Ukraine were to have joined NATO, it would have meant very clearly that Ukraine was out of Russia's sphere of control. And Russian policy since 2014 and even before then was about trying to bring Ukraine back in Russia's sphere of control after it had left in 1991, 1992 as the Soviet Union collapsed. And so NATO was primarily seen in Moscow as a way of solidifying Western influence at the expense of Russian influence. And if you as a policymaker in Moscow set your goal as reestablishing or reasserting Russian influence in the post-Soviet space, then any sort of institutions that countered that goal would be seen as a threat. And I think that's the real sense in which NATO membership, hypothetically NATO membership for Ukraine was threatening. It was threatening because it undermined the goal of bringing Ukraine back in the Russian sphere of influence.
No, absolutely, because on one hand, Professor Miller, they're already the Baltic states, which among the first to join NATO, Lithuania right there. And if anything, Putin's actions have sort of create a more unified sense of Ukrainian nationalism, which some may have said was not as strong before. There was still a pro-Russia element, at least in the Donbass region. Has that now sort of more or less become solidified in the sense that Zelensky, a comedian before he became a politician, has now seen sort of as this purveyor of peace and resilience in the form of oppression?
Well, I think that's right. Certainly in the short term, Russia's attack on Ukraine has strengthened Zelensky, both within Ukraine and outside of it. It's certainly substantially reduce the number of Ukrainian political leaders who would be willing to be described as pro-Russian to a really tiny number. And although I haven't seen opinion polling on this question since the war began, I would be shocked if there hadn't been a further swing towards support for joining NATO since the war began. Of course, now it's more obvious than ever why this would be a useful thing for Ukraine to do. So yes, I think in that sense, all of this has backfired. I think we're still waiting to see what the Russian strategy is going forward. I do worry that the Russian government thinks it can still win a long, drawn-out war of attrition with Ukraine, imposing economic costs on Ukraine by cutting it off from all Black Sea trade, which it has succeeded in doing. I'm not sure this is a war that Russia can realistically win if it lasts for many months or years, but I'm not sure whether the Kremlin thinks it might be able to win. And so I do worry that Russia still doesn't think it's lost.
Professor Miller, that's a good segue to what you mentioned about the Kremlin, because there's always been a nebulousness when you try to understand these great civilizations in Russia and China, which some see today as revanchist powers. There are books like All the Kremlin's Men, but a lot of people still are unable to understand how the Kremlin functions or who are Putin's advisors. Is it just Sergei Shoigu, Sergei Naryshkin, Sergei Lavrov? We know it's a close quarter of advisors, but normally this is still the 21st century where the Russians are connected to outside despite the disinformation of the Kremlin. So how does Putin expect to even survive the internal pressures? We know protesters are being arrested and dissenters are being locked away, but who are his advisors and how do you expect to survive against, sort of the popular opinion maybe in Russia or maybe some of the contrarian opinion that's going on?
Well, we don't have great granularity into who's advising Putin at this moment. We have plenty of evidence that since the pandemic, Putin has isolated himself far more than previously. And this means that his circle of advisors has decreased. We know that in the past and today, it appears that Putin takes plenty of advice from the chiefs of the various security services in Russia, and we've got only really limited windows into their thinking on a regular basis. But I think it's certainly become increasingly clear that the number of people providing advice to Putin is shrinking, and those who would advise a more conciliatory policy are those who have been cut out of the conversation. So the Russian Foreign Ministry has never been a major player in the making of Russian foreign policy, but they're even less so today. The business elite, so far as I can tell, has not been widely consulted. And it does seem like this war was devised primarily by consultation with some combination of Putin's security service chiefs and maybe some personal friends of his, but not with any sort of consultation with actual experts in Ukrainian politics, for example, who have told him that Ukraine is not about to fold in the face of his demands.
Yeah, Professor Miller, obviously, as the author of Putinomics and Authority of, on Russia's economic strategy under Putin, obviously the elephant in the room has always been about energy and oil. We saw about Germany pulling back on Nord Stream and talking about other countries cutting back on oil and energy imports from Russia. Perhaps the first part of my question is, does Putin try to mitigate some of the EU loss of business by looking at China, which of course is one of the world's largest energy importers and which also has its own sort of acrimony at the West? Obviously, is the China market going to try and compensate from where Russia has been hit with sanctions? And two is, what does Putinomics 2.0 look like in the face of sanctions? Because Putin's sort of rise to power has been sort of providing some form of economic stability at the turn of the century. In millennia, they were seen as part of BRICS and emerging. But what would that look like now in the face of sanctions? Does Putin survive this economic ball that's thrown at him?
Yeah. Well, on the economic front, there's three different challenges that Russia faces right now. So one is that it looks like the European Union is about to implement some sort of ban on oil purchases from Russia. There might be some exceptions to this. It's not clear exactly when it will be implemented, but it looks like it's coming. And so that means that Russia needs to find other customers for its oil, because today it sells around half of its oil to Europe. And this will be challenging. Some of it will be very, very difficult to ship because most of the shipping and insurance and logistics goes through European companies, which might be prohibited from dealing in oil. So we've seen some countries like India dramatically ramp up purchases of oil from Russia, China to a lesser extent, but still substantial. And so that will be a big question going forward, as to what extent do India, China, and other potential consumers of Russian oil choose to buy more of it, and to what extent do they succeed in buying more of it, given the logistical constraints, the fact that European and Western firms control a lot of the logistical choke points. When it comes to gas, it's a lot more trickier for Russia. On the one hand, there won't be an immediate European gas embargo because Europe needs the gas, but it's also clear that Europe is going to phase out its purchases of Russian gas over the coming years. Over what timeline still remains to be seen. But most of Russia's gas exports are piped to Europe, and so Russia can't export them anywhere else unless other pipelines are built. And so there will be an interesting question, I think, over the next decade as where Russia builds other pipelines to. And if you think of other big gas customers, building a gas pipeline to India would require building a pipeline through Afghanistan. That probably doesn't seem that viable at this point. You can build a gas pipeline in the Middle East, but it doesn't need gas. So China is really the one swing customer for Russian gas. And so it'd be an interesting question to see whether Russia does build a new pipeline to China to sell gas to China. It'd be a big, inexpensive project, though it's possible. The place where Russia is really in trouble is in terms of importing technology, because the US, Europe, UK, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore have all imposed really strict export controls on Russia. Including on the importation of advanced semiconductors, which are all produced in these countries. And so we've seen plenty of evidence of Russian firms already struggling to get components, especially microelectronic components, from abroad. And there's basically no way this can be replaced by other sources. The only other potential option is China, but China really lags behind in the semiconductor sphere. And so for a whole different array of advanced machinery and equipment, electronics, computing, Russia will be basically cut off from the most advanced technology. And this can have a really problematic impact for Russia going forward. It hasn't really been visible in the macro data yet, but it's going to become increasingly relevant as Russian firms struggle to get the components they need to produce. And so I think this will be a story that we haven't heard about yet, but we're going to hear about a lot as we get towards the end of this year, as Russian companies just can't get the machinery, the computing equipment they need to do business.
Yeah, Professor Miller, I mean, I know as a historian, it's about looking at the past, and it's very hard to predict the future right now because this war's caught everyone by surprise. But perhaps two fronts here. One is a life for normal Russians. I mean, it's no longer the Soviet Union era. It's neither China in the same way behind the Great Firewall. Yes, there's a disinformation campaign and dissenters are unable to speak out. But what sort of public pressure do you see building up in Russia, or in order, and how would that even be a fraction of a threat to Putin's control at Kremlin? And perhaps how do you see this war going right now? At what point does Putin, try to concede both in losses of life, which has not gone well, loss of military equipment, but more importantly, the economic warfare that's going to pummel Russia's economy with the ruble collapsing, Russia's banking system being ousted of the SWIFT payment. So at some point, Russia doesn't work in a silo. So the economic pressure is just going to collapse. That's what that's what the West foresees.
Well, I think that's right. That's what some people are expecting. I think public pressure, my sense is it will be limited because the Russian government has really increased the use of repression in the past couple of months and the past couple of years to the extent that it's really quite dangerous now to speak up on an issue like this. And many of those who would have spoken up have now left the country. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Russians have fled over the past couple of months. And so I think it's difficult to see a sort of street protest movement emerging in major cities on its own. And so I think we should be looking instead towards signs of elite splits, of which none are obviously visible right now, but it's clear there are parts of the elite that are unhappy with the war and unhappy the way it's been pursued. And so that's, I think, where political change will come from, if in fact it does come. Beyond that, I don't have a crystal ball into whether Putin will change his thinking about the war, but it does seem to me to be a complicated situation. If you're Putin, you've started the war, you've staked your name to the war, you've declared it would be an easy war, you declared it would be so costless, it's not even a war, it's actually a special military operation in Russian parlance. And then to be defeated in that would be a very embarrassing thing. It would be very hard to justify, domestically hard to justify to your security chiefs, hard to explain how you managed to be defeated by a country that was a small fraction of your size and that you've been telling yourself and your populace for the previous decade was weak and divided and run by corrupt oligarchs. It's pretty embarrassing to accept defeat if you're Putin, which is why it's certainly possible that he does, but I don't think we should count on it because I think I struggle to see how Putin accepts defeat, goes home to the populace and to the security chiefs and continues ruling in the current fashion. And if he knows that he'll struggle to accept defeat and continue ruling, that I think will give him every incentive he needs to refuse to admit defeat and to keep fighting.
Professor Miller, I know we're out of time, but just one last question is not to be contrarian or play devil's advocate, but of course academics like Mearsheimer have spoken about Ukraine being the West's fault in a famous speech, and we spoke about how NATO expansion, of course, while a threat to Russia is not the only reason. But a lot of the counter-argument has been, while Russia's invasion of Ukraine is absolutely condemnable, has been it's almost as if there was a China-led security pact and Mexico were to join it. And we've seen some of this play out in history with the Cuban Missile Crisis and how Kennedy and the U.S. reacted. Is it all any charity to that theory, or where did the West perhaps go wrong in perhaps provoking Russia and now getting this sort of dragon bear thing that we have with the Russia-China consensus?
Well, I think where the West went wrong is not on that front. I think if it's now, I think, abundantly clear that we've for too long ignored the role of far-right nationalism in Russian politics, ignored the role of anti-Ukrainian sentiment of the type that led to the massacres in Bucha in Russian politics, that we pretended that this sentiment was actually just about NATO enlargement, that it was actually rational and that you could sort of understand it via Mearsheimer's theories, when in reality Mearsheimer's theories were just giving cover to a really dangerous and noxious form of nationalism that was intent on asserting control over neighbors without any justification. And so I think where the West went wrong is that the type of aid that it's now giving Ukraine was for a very long time seen as dangerous precisely because it would provoke the Russians. And that was wrong. That was wrong. Until February 24th, the debate in the U.S. was, is it okay or not to give Ukraine anti-tank missiles to use against the Russians? And I think now, as we look back historically, the question is, how much better would things have been had Ukraine had the types of serious defenses it needs to defend itself? And so I look at Ukraine's struggles to, for example, in the early days of the war, to close its airspace to Russian aircraft that were bombing Ukrainian cities, and say, would things have been better if Ukraine had a much more effective air defense system? Would the situation have been more stable if Ukraine had more advanced long-range anti-ship missiles, the type that could clear Russian warships out of Ukrainian waters and reopening shipping for grain from the Black Sea? Would Russia have been more cautious if Ukraine had more intermediate-range strike systems that could have, from the earliest days of the war, brought the war home to Russian cities? I think now that we're 3 months into a war that's seen Russia rain all sorts of havoc and destruction on Ukrainian cities, I think those are the questions we ought to be asking. The question is not, did we provoke Russia? It's, why did we do so little to give Ukraine the weapons that it needs, and very evidently needs, to defend itself? And that's where I think when the war finally does end and we look back on it, the shocking thing will be how much debate there was over giving Ukraine a small number of obviously defensive systems like short-range anti-tank missiles, and how little debate there was about, because it was seen as just incomprehensible to give Ukraine the types of systems that would have actually been necessary to deter Russia.
Professor Miller, at the outset, thank you so much for breaking down the complexities of this conflict that seems never ending right now, and putting history in bite-sized formula for us. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
And with that, we bring this episode to a close. This interview was recorded on May 17th, 2022, 3 months into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As we record this, it remains to be seen how future events will unfold, or if there is any immediate end in sight. Until next time on The Global Detail, where we continue to broaden our perspectives and deepen our understanding. This podcast has been a production of Karkata Media in association with Perspicacity Media LLC. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, email us at globaldetailpodcast@gmail.com, or you can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at Global Detail Pod. This recording, or any portion thereof, may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a review. Copyright 2022 by Karkata Media LLC. All rights reserved.